How many times have you apologized for being tired? How often have you justified your sadness by blaming the weather or explained your decisions so carefully that you barely recognized your own voice at the end? We call this being polite, being considerate, being clear. But what if it isn't? What if, beneath all that explaining, there is something darker, a quiet submission you didn't even notice yourself making? Carl Jung saw this pattern with piercing clarity. He believed that the compulsion to explain yourself endlessly is not a gesture of kindness, but a symptom of self-disconnection. Every time you add, because after your truth, you are bargaining for the right to exist. You are saying, I need you to approve of me before I can approve of myself. And that bargain is nothing less than a prison, a silent one, built not of bars and locks, but of endless justifications. Think about it. The people who live most freely don't explain their choices, their feelings, or their direction. They don't shrink themselves down with, I'm sorry, I was just tired, or I didn't mean it like that. They simply live. Their silence is not emptiness, it is power, and this is the paradox. We believe explaining ourselves makes us understood, that it will ease tension and keep peace. But more often, it chains us tighter to the very people and expectations we are trying to escape. That'll be why the end of this video. You will see why Jung believed that silence holds more strength than all the explanations in the world. You will see why every withheld justification is an act of liberation. And maybe, for the first time, you'll realize that you never needed to explain yourself in the first place. We tell ourselves that explaining is harmless, a way of being polite, careful, understood. But if you listen closely, there's something fragile beneath those words. Something that doesn't sound like strength, but like survival. Think back to childhood. Do you remember how often your feelings were dismissed? Maybe you cried, only to hear, stop being dramatic. Maybe you expressed excitement, only to be told, calm down, you're too much. Or perhaps you dared to be angry, only for someone to laugh and say, don't be silly, you're not really upset. Little by little, you were taught a dangerous lesson, that your emotions were not valid on their own. They needed a reason. They needed proof. They needed permission. So the child learns a trick. Instead of simply saying, I'm tired, they add, because I stayed up too late. Instead of saying, I'm sad, they dress it up with logic. I'm just stressed about school. Instead of admitting, I'm angry, they soften it. I didn't sleep well, that's why. The raw truth was never enough. It had to be dressed in excuses to be tolerated. Carl Jung called this kind of pattern a fracture between the self and the ego. The self, your whole, authentic being, does not explain itself. It simply exists. It feels tired, it feels sad, it feels angry, and that truth is complete. But the ego, shaped by rejection, grows cautious. It becomes like a lawyer, always defending, always making a case to justify its presence. Every explanation is a way of begging silently. Do I have permission to feel this? Do I have permission to be this person? And here lies the wound beneath the words. We think we are being considerate when we explain ourselves, but in reality, we are still the child standing in front of an authority figure, pleading not to be punished, pleading to be accepted. Explaining yourself becomes less about communication and more about survival. Think about your own life. How many times have you downplayed your truth just to soften its impact? How many times have you said, I'm fine, just tired, when really you were on the edge of collapse? How often have you smoothed your anger into something palatable so no one would turn away from you? Each of those moments is not small. Each one is a betrayal, a tiny fracture where you abandon yourself to maintain approval. Jung believed that these fractures accumulate until the soul grows restless. You can only betray yourself so many times before you begin to feel hollow, restless, even ill. That is why he said neurosis often arises when the ego continually abandons the self. It is not that life becomes unbearable. It is that your own silence, your own swallowed truths, become unbearable. The wound beneath the words is not about politeness. It is about exile. Exile from your own self. And until you begin to see this clearly, every explanation you give will tighten the chains that keep you living a life shaped not by your truth, but by your fear of rejection. If the wound beneath the words begins in childhood, then the fear behind justification is the chain that carries it into adulthood. We grow older, but the same story repeats itself in new disguises. The child who begged for permission to feel becomes the adult who begs for permission to live. Think about it. Why do we over-explain our choices? Why do we justify our feelings? Why do we defend our boundaries as though they are crimes? Beneath every because, there is a silent terror. The terror of being rejected. The terror of being abandoned. The terror of being unloved. When you say, "I can't come because I'm busy," what you often mean is, "Please don't be angry with me." When you explain, "I didn't mean to upset you. I was just tired," what you mean is, "Please don't leave me." When you justify, "I'm not upset. I'm just stressed," what you mean is, "Please don't withdraw your love." The words are not about honesty. They are about survival. Carl Jung warned us that this constant performance for approval is one of the greatest obstacles to individuation. To individuate means to become whole, to stand in your own authority, to no longer be fragmented by fear. But as long as fear drives you to explain yourself, you are still a prisoner of other people's judgments. You are still shaping your truth to keep their acceptance. And notice how this fear hides itself. It pretends to be consideration, humility, maturity. But if you strip away the polite surface, what remains is raw terror. If I don't explain myself, I will lose you. And so life becomes an endless performance. Not a life lived from the inside out, but one lived from the outside in, bending, twisting, reshaping itself to avoid rejection. This is why Jung believed that most people never truly live. They exist as masks, as performances, as roles written for them by fear. They explain themselves into exhaustion, into neurosis, into despair. Because beneath every sentence lies the same desperate plea. Please don't turn away from me. The fear behind justification is not small. It is the fear of abandonment, the fear of exile from the tribe, the fear of being invisible. And until it is confronted, every explanation you give will not be communication, but confession, a confession that you still believe your existence must be earned. Not all betrayals are dramatic. Sometimes they are quiet, almost invisible. And yet, these are the ones that wound us most deeply, because we commit them against ourselves every single day. Think about how often you've said yes when you're entire. Being was screaming no. How many times? Have you laughed at a joke you didn't find funny, just to smooth the moment? How many times have you told someone, "I'm fine, I'm just tired," when the truth was that you were drowning in sadness? These aren't just harmless gestures. They are tiny fractures. Each time you silence your truth in order to remain acceptable, a small part of you is abandoned. Each time you bend yourself into a version that others can tolerate, another piece of your wholeness is left behind. Society praises this. It rewards the agreeable, the polite, the person who can explain away their truth in a way that offends no one. On the surface, such a person is easy to love, easy to keep around. But inside, something else is happening. The soul is being chipped away, one compromise at a time. Carl Jung warned that this is where neurosis takes root. When the ego continually betrays the self, it creates an unbearable tension. The self longs to be whole, but the ego keeps abandoning it for approval. Eventually, the body begins to protest, with exhaustion, with anxiety, with illness. The psyche cries out through depression, through restlessness, through a deep sense of meaninglessness. These self-betrayals may seem small in the moment. Saying yes when you want no, smiling when you want silence, explaining when you want to stand firm. But they accumulate. They build a life that looks stable from the outside but feels hollow within. And the more you betray yourself, the more foreign your own soul becomes to you. Jung believed that healing begins with reclaiming these small moments, with daring to say no when you mean it, with daring to let silence stand instead of offering explanations, with daring to be disliked, rather than betraying yourself for temporary approval. Because every time you choose your truth over convenience, a fragment of your soul returns. The subtle betrayals are easy to miss, but they are the real reason so many lives feel heavy, unfulfilled, restless. You don't need a catastrophe to feel broken. All it takes is 1,000 small abandonments of yourself, repeated day after day, until you no longer recognize the person in the mirror. There comes a moment when the exhaustion of explaining yourself outweighs the fear of what will happen if you stop. That moment is the beginning of internal authority. The moment you no longer look outside for permission to exist. What does it mean to have internal authority? It doesn't mean arrogance. It doesn't mean ignoring others or closing yourself off. It means that your truth no longer has to be filtered through someone else's comfort before it feels real to you. It means that your feelings, your choices, your direction do not require negotiation. They simply are. Carl Jung understood individuation, the process of becoming whole, as a movement toward this kind of authority. To individuate is to stop seeking validation from the crowd, from the tribe, from the external world. It is to recognize that yourself is already whole and that no explanation can make it more so. Silence, in this sense, is not emptiness. It is presence. When you no longer explain yourself, your words carry more weight, not less. A simple no, thank you spoken without justification is infinitely stronger than a long explanation filled with excuses. A boundary held quietly, without defense, is harder to push against than one wrapped in apologies. Think about the power of those who command respect without raising their voice. They are not scrambling for approval. They are not filling the air with reasons. Their authority is not in their arguments, but in their being. That is the shift Jung points us toward, from external permission to internal certainty. And here is the paradox. When you stop explaining yourself, you might lose people. The ones who relied on your justifications to control, you will find your silence unbearable. But you will also gain something far greater, integrity, a wholeness that no opinion can touch. Jung believed that this is where true transformation begins. When you no longer bargain for your existence, you finally live it. When you no longer seek permission to speak, you begin to hear the deeper voice within you, the voice of the self. That is the breakthrough. Silence has a strange reputation in our world. We are taught to fear it, to rush to fill it with words, to explain, to justify, to smooth over the gaps. But Carl Jung saw silence differently. He saw it as one of the most powerful forces a human being can embody. When you stop explaining yourself, something begins to shift in the people around you. Manipulators lose their grip because they depend on your words to twist and distort. Without your explanations, there is nothing for them to grab. Those who relied on your endless justifications to guilt you or control you suddenly find themselves powerless. Silence exposes their weakness, but silence is not only a defense. It is also a mirror. When you no longer explain, you begin to see who truly values you. Some people cannot stay when the justifications end because what they loved was not you, but the performance you gave them. Others, however, will remain, even grow closer. They will find your silence grounding, your presence steady, your authenticity magnetic. In this way, silence becomes a filter. It reveals who belongs in your life and who does not. And here is the paradox. Silence can be louder than any speech. When you stop justifying yourself, your boundaries carry a gravity that no argument could achieve. A simple refusal spoken without apology is unmovable. A quiet choice made without explanation is undeniable. The less you defend your life, the more undeniable it becomes. Jung believed that individuation requires ruptures. Friendships may fall away. Relationships may crack. Entire chapters of your life may end. But these endings are not failures. They are proof that you are no longer living for approval. They are the echoes of a life shifting from performance to presence. Silence, then, is not absence. It is not weakness. It is the declaration of inner authority without the need for words. It is the space where your soul steps forward, no longer deluded by explanation, no longer begging to be seen. Silence is your truest voice. Integrity is not about being perfect. It is not about obeying every rule or living up to every expectation. Integrity, in the deepest sense, means wholeness. It means you no longer split yourself into pieces just to be acceptable. Every time you explain yourself when you don't need to, you chip away at that wholeness. You create a gap between who you are and who you present to the world. And the more gaps you create, the less connected you feel to yourself. Jung warned us that this constant fragmentation is one of the greatest dangers of the modern soul. You become scattered, a collection of roles, masks, and performances, instead of a unified being. But when you stop explaining, something profound happens. The fragments begin to return. The part of you that always said yes when you meant no finds its strength again. The part that dressed its sadness in excuses finally feels free to speak honestly. The part that begged for permission discovers it never needed to ask. Integrity is when your words, your feelings, and your actions align, without apology, without disguise. It is when your no is firm, your yes is real, and your silence is enough. It is when the self and the ego no longer fight each other, but move as one dot. And here lies the paradox. The less you seek approval, the more respect you command. People may not always agree with you, but they will feel the weight of your presence. You will no longer be a person to negotiate with, but a person to reckon with. Jung believed that wholeness, not happiness, is the true goal of life. Happiness comes and goes, but wholeness gives you something greater. It gives you a center. A place to stand that no criticism, no rejection, no abandonment can shake. When you reclaim your integrity, you reclaim that center. You stop scattering yourself for acceptance and instead begin to live as one. To live with integrity is not to be flawless. It is to be undivided. And there is nothing more powerful than a human being who is whole. At some point in your life, you realize that the prison you've been living in was never built by others. It was built by you, brick by brick, word by word, explanation by explanation. Every, "I'm sorry, I was just tired." Every, "I didn't mean it. I was just stressed." Every excuse, every justification, every bargain you made for the right to exist. These became the walls of your cell. But here's the truth Carl Jung wanted us to confront. You were never meant to live inside those walls. The door has always been unlocked. The only thing keeping you inside is fear. Fear of rejection, fear of being misunderstood, fear of being unloved. Yet the moment you stop explaining yourself, you discover something extraordinary. The people who truly belong in your life don't need explanations. They never did. And so the shift begins. You stop betraying yourself in small ways. You stop negotiating your boundaries, watering down your feelings, or justifying your truth. Instead, you stand in it. Firm, quiet, whole. This is not arrogance. It is liberation. Every withheld explanation is not an absence. It is an act of reclamation. Every silence is not weakness. It is strength. Every time you refuse to defend who you are, you remind yourself that you were never on trial in the first place. The final shift is this. Respect does not come from explanation. It comes from integrity. Power does not come from justification. It comes from presence. And freedom does not come from convincing others to accept you. It comes from accepting yourself. So, I'll leave you with a question, one that might change everything. What is the explanation you are ready to stop giving? Write it down. Speak it aloud. Leave it in the comments. This might be the first step toward the life that has always been waiting for you. The life where you no longer beg for permission to exist because you finally know you never needed it.